Hello, and welcome to the Practical Prophetic, where prophetic ministry is made practical. I'm Beth Wingate, I'm your host, and welcome to the podcast. On our podcast today, we are going to talk about little foxes become big bad wolves. So today we're going practical, but I have a reason why. I'm going to root us in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20. But before I read it, I want to tell a little story. Of course, we all know the story about the big bad wolf and the three little pigs, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I just wanted to draw that illustration to paint a picture for you. Years ago, we were in a church. It was a charismatic church. We were only there, a very short time, and it was birthed out of a Bible study that we went to when we were new to the Pentecostal charismatic movement. This would have been in the 80s. And this couple had a Bible study, and this church that we were attending had a pastor and we had a quote-unquote prophet, which was very groundbreaking and very new, and it did not go well. There's an old saying that says anything with more than one head or anything with two heads is a monster. Leadership is hierarchical. You can really only have ultimately one leader. You have to have a hierarchy of structure. I know that's not popular in today's culture, but anytime you have two leaders, that's not going to be a good thing. You're going to always gravitate to one over the other. Now, you can have, like in our nation, divided government, but ultimately, we have an executive in our president. So we do have one leader. The analogy is in the military. If you're on the confusion of the battlefield, you can't have multiple voices. So you have a clear chain of command. And God is a God of order, and He's a God of structure, and that's the way He has ordered spiritual authority. I'm a big believer in spiritual authority. So years ago, we were in this church that had a pastor and a prophet, and the man who was the quote-unquote prophet, he actually did hear from God, and he gave some very powerful prophecies, and many came true, and things of this nature. But there was a problem. He was not a very nice guy, and he was rude and condescending to people and arrogant, and it ended up where him and the pastor came to an impasse, and the church basically ended up dissolving because of this guy's personality. He was problematic, and there was just multiple layers of how he was problematic. But here he was with the title of a prophet. And so it didn't take us long to figure out. By the way, sidebar, we got into an organized denominational Pentecostal church and the Assemblies of God because this structure was just too loose, and that wasn't for us. We needed that spiritual authority. And this is what can happen when you don't have spiritual authority. Now, you can have spiritual authority in a non-denominational church, but they do need to have some kind of leadership structure, and this one really just lacked all of that. It was young people who had had a Bible study, and then it grew into a church, and it could have really been a wonderful thing, but it lacked that structure. Anyway, so this is what happens when little foxes are fed, and they become big, bad wolves. And this is really just a principle in your life. This has so much practical application. I use this analogy all the time. Now, we're also going to root our study in Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 15. And this is the one about the little foxes spoiling the vine. Let me read that first. It says, "Catch us the foxes, the little foxes that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes." In other words, it's these little bitty foxes that keep stealing the grapes and messing up the vines, and it's going to spoil the whole vineyard. Joyce Meyer says it this way: small compromise equals big problems. Now, I want to connect that with Matthew 7:15 through 20, and this is why this is important as quote-unquote prophetic people. It says, And I love this right here. It says, beware of false prophets. We could stop right there and unpack that. So you mean not everyone who claims to be a prophet of the Bible, of God, of Jesus, is not legitimate? That there are false prophets inside the church, so to speak? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. Man, you will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs or from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but bad trees bear bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Oh my goodness, there's so much here to unpack. Now, of course, a fox can't turn into a wolf, but I want to use this analogy that a fox here represents things that can spoil things of value, and a vineyard is very valuable in the ancient world. It's an agrarian society. Everything was a seed, a garden after its own kind. And so this is an analogy that our lives are like a garden. Everything that you do is a garden. And the very first commandment that God gave to Adam was to tend and guard the garden. This is the part that deals with guarding the garden. And sometimes we think that means big bad wolves coming through the garden, but no, it's those little foxes. You have to nip it. It's springtime and I've been doing a little work out in the yard, and I have one of these raised beds. Well, I made the mistake initially of having it on the ground. I've since moved it to concrete. But from last year where it was on the ground, I am having to go through and weed my container garden here, my raised bed, which really should have been weed-free. But now I'm having to go in while they're little and pull up these weeds, because if they get big and take hold, they can even choke out the fruit that I have planted. I'm growing tomatoes in this box. They can choke out that fruit, that tomato on the vine, which is, like the grapes on the vine. So these little things that we often overlook can add up to big problems. Now, I'm going to make the analogy that these little foxes, if you feed them, they can morph or turn into the big bad wolf, because they represent sin in our lives. Some of the things that these little foxes can represent are wrong attitudes, a critical spirit, offense, insecurity, pride, unforgiveness, an unteachable spirit, willful sin, unconfessed sin, injustice, shame, or guilt. These are just some of the things these foxes can represent. And I'm telling you, you have to uproot the weed when it's tiny. You have to shut out the fox out of your garden. But let me tell you, the enemy, which is represented by these little foxes, that if you allow them to feed in the fruit of your garden, can become very problematic and turn into the big bad wolf. By the way, wolves and foxes are in the same genus or species of animals. So they are somewhat related, even though, naturally a fox can't turn into a wolf. But I'm just using that analogy. But listen, our adversary, Satan, is like a cunning fox, one who has the cunning ability to achieve something in a clever way. In 2 Corinthians 2:11, it says, "Lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices, in order that Satan may not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes." I want to key in on two words in this scripture. The first one is the word advantage, or outwitted or outsmarted. In the Greek, this word actually means to orbit, to go around something like a planet orbiting the sun. In 1 Peter 5:8, it says, "Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." The devil orbits around our lives, around your garden, trying to seek spiritual advantage over us through wrong attitudes, pride, unforgiveness, an unteachable spirit, willful sin, etc. These are open doors for the enemy. Oh my goodness. You have to tend and guard your garden. Let's also look at this word, schemes, which means to secretly plot against. This is the Greek word nomia, meaning to have a definite thought against, to ponder at length, planning precisely someone's demise or defeat. The enemy is continually taking notes, studying our lives to come up with a scheme, because the Bible tells us that the enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. But Jesus came that we might have life and have life more abundantly. Abundant does not mean that you're just trying to survive out here. It means you are thriving, and that's what He's called us to do. We must be on guard against the enemy, and we do that with the weapons of our warfare. 2 Corinthians 10:14 says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." Our lives are like a garden, and we bear fruit. But I say this all the time. This fruit that the Bible speaks of, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, self-control, these don't just magically fall on you out of heaven. You have to cultivate these fruits in your garden, and you have to constantly weed the garden. You have to protect the garden from predators like foxes. Now, foxes don't seem that harmful. They seem like, just like a little dog or something. But let me tell you, I've got some facts here that I looked up on foxes. They're really quite interesting. Foxes are very cunning hunters. Listen. They catch a wide variety of prey. They have a wide appetite that can vary. They can live in many different habitats. They're very adaptable. They can produce over 40 different vocalizations or sounds for communication and hunting. They have a keen sense of smell, hearing, night vision, and they have been studied where they use the Earth's magnetic field to aid them in hunting. Fascinating. So they're very good hunters. The enemy will find your weakness, and that's what he'll strategize against you. So you always need to be shoring up the weakness. Foxes primarily hunt at night. They can retract their claws similar to cats. Foxes, some of the really interesting things about foxes is when they are being pursued, they can actually, like a cat, they can climb a tree, and then they can jump from branch to branch, and then will come down a different tree to outfox people. Of course, that's a saying, outfox people. And so foxes are very crafty, very cunning, and very difficult to deal with. Now, imagine, we're using the analogy of a fox being like the enemy who's come into the garden, just like the snake that came into the garden with Eve. We don't want to do that. We want to shut the enemy out. But I tell you what, it's a lot easier to shut out a fox than when it's been feasting and it morphs into a big bad wolf. And you really don't want to be dealing with a wolf in your garden, because that's going to do so much damage. We want to contain it while it's small and then eradicate it. And so really, that's the message. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Put boundaries up in your life. That's like a wall around your garden. You've got to live inside that boundary that God has put for you. You've got to cultivate the fruits of the Spirit in your life. And we need to be people of the Word. Listen, I opened up with the scripture about false prophets, and I'm connecting this to false prophets. You can't run around with a prophetic voice as a hypocrite. You can't run around with all these massive problems, holes in the wall of your garden, foxes coming in and spoiling the fruit on the vine. If you're going to be a prophetic person, we cannot do that. We have to be principled. We're not saying perfection, but principled. You have to be a person of the Word. You have to live inside the boundaries that God gave you in your garden so that you can grow the kind of fruit of the Spirit that He's called you to grow. And really, that's what I'm talking about here at the end of the day is discipline. I'm talking about being discipled, discipleship. It's an everyday thing. How do we cultivate the fruits of the Spirit? And how do we keep the wall around our garden? It is very simple. Worship, the Word, and prayer. That's called discipleship, relationship with the Lord. When the sheep are in the field, an ancient field, the shepherd at night would take stones and build a wall. And then he would put the sheep in this corral that he would build at night. And he would lay down in the entryway, becoming the very door himself. One of the words in your Bible for mercy means a walled garden. Our lives are like a walled garden, and it is our job to tend and guard the garden because we have predators. One of the words in your King James Bible for fox here can be translated as a jackal. The enemy is like a jackal, like a fox, and he's constantly seeking ways to come in and spoil the garden. But we have to be on our guard. We have to have the mercy of the Lord over our lives, the boundaries that God has given us, the boundary of obedience that we stay in, that keep us right and that keep the enemy out. And I tell you what, when one of those foxes, because they're very crafty, when one of them slips in, you've got to deal with it. You've got to nip it. You've got to repair the breach and get the fox out of the garden. Because if you don't, and those foxes continue to feast, it will evolve and grow into what I call the big bad wolf. And then you've got a major sin problem inside your garden. Not only are you lacking fruit, but now you have a monster inside the walls. And that's what we don't want to see happen. You know, it's not something that happens overnight. Let me give us this analogy. Let's say your life is a walled garden, one of these ancient stone walls around a garden, and everything inside that garden represents protection and provision. That's the very picture of mercy. The Hebrew word there is raka'im, mercy. And that wall is like our obedience to the Lord. And everything we need is provided by the Lord inside the walls of that garden. But we have an enemy. And anytime there's a breach in the wall because of our disobedience, i.e. sin, which means to miss the mark, or maybe it's transgression, which means you break a law, or maybe even it's iniquity, which is to intentionally miss the mark. It's like having a breach in the wall, and it's those little foxes. Foxes can get down really low and burrow themselves, and they can dig under a wall. Especially if there's a little gaping hole, they'll just start digging and digging and digging. My neighbor has a dog, and there's a little hole in the fence. It's not even a hole; it's where one of the boards have separated, and it's just big enough to maybe put your hand. Well, that dog has started digging and digging and digging because he sees that there's a slight opening. And so her dog has started digging. Well, they keep putting rocks and bricks and all kind of things. But eventually they're going to have to repair that hole in the fence because if that dog keeps digging, he's going to get his way out. In fact, he's actually gotten out a few times because of that. So they're going to have to repair this breach in the wall. Sometimes the breach isn't like just a big open hole. It'll be this little crack. And once the fox sees the little crack, or your dog, in your backyard, it's like, oh, I can dig. And then they start digging, and they'll attack that spot because it's vulnerable. Maybe you have an anger problem in your life. That's like a little crack in the wall. And you start popping off at people and mad about this and criticizing this and oh my goodness this and and you get angry real easy and pop off. Well, that's like that little fox sees that opening and he begins to dig and weasel his way into the garden. And at first nothing may happen. The fox is going to stay low and hide himself, and he's going to hunt at night. But when he has the right moment, he'll come in and he'll steal your fruit, which is your peace. If you're dealing with anger, then the counterpart fruit is peace. And the enemy will begin to attack you at your peace. You need to deal with this little fox and fix the hole in the wall before he morphs into a monster or the big bad wolf. And I tell you what, once they morph into the wolf, you're going to need deliverance. You have a problem going on. Let me review this real quick. So I always talk about the hierarchy of the demonic. We did a podcast on that. There's basically 3 levels. There's demonic influence, there's demonic oppression, and the final level is possession, which is, I think, somewhat kind of rare and usually brought on by drug use and, heavy levels of sin and things like that. And we can debate over whether that can happen in the life of a believer. But I can definitely tell you that a believer can be influenced demonically and even oppressed demonically. And that's like that big bad wolf. And that's something you have to then deal with. That's like a little fox that was able to feast inside your garden on your fruit and steal your fruit from you, because we have to continually tend and guard our garden. If we want God's mercy in our life, we get it through obedience, but then we have to tend and guard the garden that He's given us, which is the fruit of God in our lives that we have to cultivate. So if you want peace, you have to plant peace. If you want joy, you have to plant joy. The Bible in the book of Proverbs says to have friends, you have to be a friend. You have to be the kind of friend you want to have. You have to start walking in the kind of peace you want to have inside of you. I always say, fake it till you make it. Sometimes you got to say to yourself, you have to let your spirit man rise up and tell your flesh man how things are going to be, and take charge and say, I will have the peace of God. For God has not given me a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind, and I will walk in peace. Sometimes you have to make a declaration. You have to make a confession even before it has manifested in your life. That's called faith. You speak it in faith. I'm not saying you deny reality. I'm not saying you run around be, strange to people. But sometimes you have to just stand up, look at yourself in the mirror and say, I will not walk around angry. Or maybe it's fear that you deal with. I will not let the enemy steal my joy. I will not be fearful. I have joy in the name of Jesus. And then you begin to do things that demonstrate that in your life. And you begin to put your faith into action. Faith without works is dead. Sometimes it means you have to do something. There's power in that if you will confess it and believe it and then walk it out. You will be amazed. And that's what destroys the little foxes that come in to spoil the vine. And I hope today's message blesses and encourages you. I really believe this is as practical as I can get, but we don't want to walk around as false prophets, little p. You don't want to walk around as a hypocrite. How can you go give someone a word from the Lord of encouragement when you're over here 10 minutes earlier, blessing out the waitress because she didn't get something right on your order when she's only paid, minimum wage or whatever? Come on, we can do better. You can do better. You need to get the little foxes. Catch the little foxes and get them out of the garden, because if you don't, you're going to have a monster on your hands. And that's a whole nother thing to deal with. I hope today's message blesses and encourages you as we talk about catching the little foxes before they become the big bad wolf. Have a blessed day. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be informed next time I post. Thank you again and have a blessed day.